On November 28, 1999, in Seattle, the World Trade Organization meeting began, which is the start of a big conflict around Seattle and can be known as the Battle of Seattle. The World Trade Organization's job was to help trade stay organized and keep trade from causing big problems that were hard to handle. All the meetings caused protesters to come and fight for the way they wanted trade to be done. During the meeting, Seattle leaders spent more time worrying about police and protesters, leading to an unsuccessful end. Although the World Trade Organization's Seattle 1999 conference had some very successful moments, the overall meetings and throughout the World Trade Organization was not as successful as it could have been if there had been more work to make the result better than it was.
Before the WTO was the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, which started in 1947, and then as GATT was not doing its job anymore, is when the WTO was made in, and this is around 1995. GATT was very successful for a long time, until it started to decline, and that is when the WTO came and noticed there needed to be a change. There was a transition time between GATT and the WTO from 1995 until 1997, and at the same time for the planning, the WTO meeting Seattle 1999. The WTO ended up working better than GATT did, and GATT was also more old-fashioned, so the change from GATT to WTO was worth it. The idea was to create an international world trade in 1948, but at the time it was a failed attempt. WTO started from GATT trying to create a strong, purposeful, multicultural trading system that became more liberal through round of the trade negotiations leading to Urd's Way Round and overall WTO. The GATT years from Havana to Marrakesh. GATT lasted from 1948 to 1994 and it provided rules to help make the WTO meeting a lot better. Since GATT was such a help until 1994, there was no need for a WTO meeting, and so once GATT wasn't working anymore, they would have to change the way of doing trade, causing the WTO meetings. At the start of the WTO, there were about 50 countries participating in negotiations hoping to create new trading rounds and negotiations. The first round of negotiations resulted in lots of new trade rules and $45,000 that were affecting $10 billion of trade. Once the idea was signed and started coming into effect, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade was born, with 23 members. GATT was a very powerful force until 1995. This is why the change from GATT to WTO was so important to help further the success of trade around the world.
There are lots of factors that contribute to how unsuccessful the World Trade Organization meetings were, and one of the main ones is the lack of planning that went on before the World Trade Organization meetings. When the World Trade Organization had first started, the Seattle police and leaders thought they had planned very well and done a great job with the Seattle leaders, and the police needed to do before the World Trade Organization's meetings. The Seattle leaders and police started to notice that there were lots of conflicts that wouldn't have happened if there had been better planning before the World Trade Organization meetings. As the meetings went on, some of the main problems that could have used more planning were the way police acted with the protesters and what police allowed the protesters to do while they were in Seattle. Some others were the ways police could have been prepared to ask for help instead of saying they wouldn't need help, and in the end, they did end up needing help. The conflicts during the World Trade Organization meetings had a powerful impact on world trade. This is one of the reasons why World Trade Organization was unsuccessful.
To understand protesters, first, why not talk about why protesters were protesting and what they were protesting about? Protesters' main goal were to understand and make trade organized that works best for them and their country. The protests that protesters did were to prove that what they wanted was right or to show why what they didn't want was wrong. There are multiple different compromises that people wanted, and it depended on where that person lived or how wealthy or not their country was. The farmers, like average people, weren't as wealthy and wanted trade to stay the same as it has been so that they could still sell all the crops and other items they want. People that were average in a not-so-wealthy country wanted trade to stay the same as well because of the main ways they make money is trading and selling crops and other items they have. This shows why protesters are fighting so badly for the way they want these meetings to end.
Protesters also caused a lot of problems throughout the World Trade Organization meetings and were one of the main reasons why the World Trade Organization was more unsuccessful than successful. The protesters made the World Trade Organization meetings so much harder. The protesters could roam wherever they wanted around the streets of Seattle, and that was a big mistake. It caused the policemen to have to ask for reinforcements. Once the SWAT team got to Seattle, they started to get out pepper spray, guns, and gas masks. The Peacemaker was a bulletproof car they could ride around in to deal with protesters. The protesters started to fight back after the police started to close certain streets from all the protesters. Sometimes there were problems going on that made one side on top of the other, but overall the police and protesters were close to in the same positions. Meeting would have had to be canceled since it wasn't safe outside with all the protesters. That would cause the World Trade meetings in general to take longer than expected. This caused meetings to be canceled, and that led to valuable time that could have been used better. Louis Dubreuil said, "If we desire respect for the law, we must make the law respectable." This quote is saying that if you want people to listen to the law or the rules you make, the law must be reasonable, and you must think as if you're on the other side to see if the rules are fair or not. A little while later, the police started to get more and more streets blocked off from all the protesters. Lots of protesters were going to jail from lots of different causes, like not staying out of areas that are blocked off, being too aggressive, and not doing what the police say to do. Since the police have no other choice, they decide to call in the National Guard. Altogether, the policemen with the extra health are starting to get a handle on what was going on. This is just one of the main problems that occurred during the World Trade Organization meeting in Seattle in 1999.
Police had to put their lives on hold throughout this time, and the protesters just kept getting worse, which led to all the problems following. The problems started by protesters coming after the WTO meetings were starting. Protesters caused so many more problems and conflicts than the policemen expected, making it hard for all the meetings to be held. When more and more protesters came, policemen were getting very little sleep and having a hard time doing their jobs. Coffee places started to give away free coffee to all the policemen so that they could have an easier time during work. The policemen had to sleep in very little amounts of time, and the amount that they got wasn't comfortable since they didn't get to go home to sleep. Some policemen would have to be up for up to 3 days straight before they got to get a good amount of sleep. This caused lots of problems within the WTO meetings couldn't be solved on the spot.
After the World Trade Organization, there were short-term effects that made the life harder for the people of Seattle. After the World Trade Organization meetings, 23 of the protesters were locked inside the King County Jail, and this made more protesters go to the gates of the jail and demand them to let go of the protesters. Police and Seattle leaders were dealing with the aftermath of the meetings, and Seattle still had protesters that were coming to say what they thought were wrong about the results of the World Trade Organization meeting Seattle in 1999. These were the short-term effects of the World Trade Organization meetings.
There were lots of long-term effects that influence what happens to us now in the trade world. Martha Cole says, "I don't think it'll have any problems in the long run." Most people believe that all the conflicts had to do with the meetings and not the way Seattle is running them. This meeting affected the way we should do our trade today and how trade should be planned out. There were more meetings that had happened, but nothing as major as the Seattle WTO meeting was. These were the long-term effects of the Seattle WTO meetings 1999.
Although the World Trade Organization, Seattle 1999, had some very successful moments, the overall meetings and throughout the World Trade Organization was not as successful as it could have been if there had been more work put in to make the result better than it was. The ending of the World Trade Organization meeting was in Seattle's hands more than anyone else's, and that was one of the main reasons why they failed. In the end, our problems with trade have been fixed somewhat, but the reason for that was not the Seattle 1999 World Trade Organization meeting.